I was standing in a room filled with polished marble floors, soft jazz, and people who measured each other by last names and net worth when my ex-husband finally said the words he had no right to say. "This is my daughter." He placed his hand on Laura's shoulder like it belonged there. Like 21 years of absence could be erased with a single gesture. Like time hadn't passed. Like choices didn't have consequences. Like he could step back into a role he had abandoned before it ever began. For a second, the room didn't react. Conversations paused mid-sentence. A woman near the bar froze with her glass halfway to her lips. Someone behind me let out a quiet breath they didn't realize they were holding. And then Laura looked at him. Calm. Steady. Unshaken. "No," she said. Her voice quiet but impossibly clear. "You're not my father." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. Like something had just cracked open. And everyone in that room could feel it, even if they didn't understand it. Joshua's smile faltered for the first time. What he didn't understand, what he couldn't possibly understand, was that this moment didn't belong to him. He thought he was walking into a reunion. He had no idea he was stepping into a reckoning. And the worst part, he still believed he was in control. I had learned a long time ago that rooms like this weren't about what people said. They were about what people showed without realizing it. The way someone held eye contact a second too long. The way voices softened when money entered the conversation. The way power moved quietly between people who never needed to raise their voices. Years ago, I used to feel out of place in spaces like this. Now, I knew how to stand in them without shrinking. The ballroom was filled with the low hum of strategic conversations. The kind that sounded casual but were never accidental. Lawyers, investors, executives, people who understood that reputation was currency, and perception was everything. I stood near the edge of a small gathering, a glass in my hand I hadn't touched, watching without needing to be seen. Laura stood beside me, completely at ease. She didn't fidget. She didn't scan the room for approval. She didn't adjust herself to fit the space. She belonged to herself in a way that made everything else irrelevant. That was something no one had given her. That was something she had learned. And he had no idea. I noticed Joshua before he noticed us. He was across the room, exactly where someone like him would position himself, close enough to the center to be seen, far enough from the edges to avoid looking like he was trying too hard. The suit was tailored. The watch was expensive. His posture was the same as I remembered, controlled, deliberate, confident in a way that came from believing things would always work out in his favor. Time had changed the details, but not the structure. He was still the kind of man who believed he could manage outcomes. For a moment, I just watched him, not with anger, not even with resentment, just recognition. Laura followed my gaze. "Is that him?" she asked quietly. I nodded once. Yes. She didn't react the way most people would expect. No tension. No hesitation. No visible shift at all. If anything, she seemed more still, more focused. She had seen his face before. Of course, photos existed. Information was never hard to find anymore. But seeing someone in person, the way they moved, the way they carried themselves, that was different. That told you things you couldn't learn from a screen. And Laura had always been someone who paid attention to those things. Joshua turned then, his eyes scanning the room in that same familiar way, like he was searching for something he already believed he deserved to find. And then he saw us. There was a flicker of surprise, real. This time, but it disappeared quickly, replaced by that practiced composure he had always relied on. He adjusted his expression before he even started walking toward us. That was the first thing I noticed. Not what he said, not what he did, but how quickly he corrected himself. Like this was just another situation to manage. Like we were variables he could still control. The conversations around us softened as he approached. Not because people were paying attention yet, but because something about the shift in energy made them aware, even if they couldn't name it. I felt Laura straighten slightly beside me. Not defensively, not nervously, but with intention. Joshua stopped in front of us, close enough that I could see the faint lines time had left around his eyes, the subtle tension in his jaw that hadn't been there before. "Megan," he said, as if the years between us were nothing more than a pause in a conversation we could easily resume. I didn't respond right away. I didn't need to. He turned to Laura almost immediately, his attention shifting exactly where he wanted it to go. That, too, hadn't changed. He didn't build bridges. He stepped over what he didn't consider important. There was a small box in his hand I hadn't noticed before. He held it out toward her. "For you," he said. A simple gesture. Polite, controlled. But I knew what it was. Not the object itself. The intention behind it. Laura took it without hesitation. Her expression unchanged. Her movements calm. "Thank you," she said. Nothing more. He seemed to take that as a good sign. That was the second thing I noticed. He still mistook politeness for acceptance. Around us, a few people had started to glance in our direction, drawn by something they couldn't quite define yet. Joshua shifted his stance slightly, angling himself just enough to include them in his space without making it obvious. And that was when I understood exactly what he was about to do. He wasn't here for a conversation. He was here for a moment. And he was about to make it public. But this didn't start here. It started 21 years ago, in a small living room where I learned exactly how little we meant to him. It didn't start with a fight. It didn't start with raised voices or accusations or even a warning I could recognize in time to stop it. It started with silence, the kind that lingers just a little too long, the kind that fills a room without anyone saying a word, the kind that makes you feel something is off, even when everything looks exactly the same. I was sitting on the couch in our small apartment in Phoenix, my laptop balanced on my knees, trying to finish editing a video before the light outside faded. 6 months pregnant. Tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. I had learned to work in short, focused bursts between moments of discomfort. The air felt heavy that afternoon. Not hot. Not cold. Just still. I heard the front door open. Joshua walked in without saying anything. "No, hey. No, how was your day?" No glance in my direction. That was the first thing that felt wrong. I looked up from my screen, watching him as he moved through the room like he was following a plan I wasn't part of. His expression was neutral, but not relaxed. Controlled. Like he had already decided something and was just waiting for the right moment to execute it. He didn't sit down. He didn't take off his jacket. He just stood there for a second, his phone in his hand, before flipping it face down on the table. That was the second thing. Joshua never did that. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my tone normal, even though something in my chest had already tightened. "Everything okay?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out a thin stack of papers. Clean. Organized. Already clipped together. He walked over and placed them on the coffee table in front of me. "We need to talk." It wasn't the words. It was how he said them. Flat. Efficient. Like this was something scheduled, not something felt. I stared at the papers for a second before picking them up. Legal formatting? Structured paragraphs. Sections highlighted in pale yellow. My eyes caught the words before my mind could process them. Petition for dissolution of marriage. I didn't react the way people expect in moments like that. No immediate tears. No shouting. No disbelief loud enough to fill the room. Just a pause. A quiet, suspended second where everything felt like it had shifted slightly out of place. "What is this?" I asked, even though I already knew. "They're already filed," he said. "I just need your signature." I looked up at him then. Really looked. His posture was straight, his expression calm, his eyes steady in a way that told me this wasn't a conversation he expected to have. It was a process he intended to complete. "When did you decide this?" I asked. He exhaled slowly, like he had rehearsed the answer. "It's not about deciding," he said. "It's about timing. Timing." I almost laughed. "Timing," I repeated. "There's an opportunity coming up," he continued. his tone slipping into something I recognized immediately: presentation mode. A promotion. More responsibility. More visibility. It's a critical point in my career trajectory. I stared at him, waiting for the part where he mentioned us. He didn't. And? I asked. And this, he gestured vaguely, his hand moving in the direction of my stomach without actually looking at it. This complicates things. For a moment, I didn't understand what he meant. And then I did. You mean the baby? I said. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. This baby is your child, I said, my voice quieter now, steadier than I felt. It's not about that, he replied quickly. It's about what it represents. The timing. The impact. The impact. Like he was talking about a delayed project. A failed investment. A variable in a model that didn't fit. It's going to hold me back, he added, almost as an afterthought. The words landed without force. No anger. No emphasis. Just a statement. I felt something shift inside me then. Not break. Shift. Because suddenly, everything made sense in a way it hadn't before. The late nights. The distance. The way he had started speaking in summaries instead of conversations. This wasn't new. This was the conclusion of something he had already decided. A faint buzz came from the table. His phone lit up for just a second. A name flashed across the screen before it went dark again. Rachel. I didn't say anything. I didn't ask. I didn't need confirmation for something that had already revealed itself. Joshua noticed the glance. Just barely. And turned the phone over completely this time, pressing it flat against the surface. Look, he said, his voice softening slightly, but not in the way it should have. This isn't personal. It's just not the right time for this. Not the right time for this. I looked down at the papers in my hands again, at the lines already signed with his name, at the spaces left blank for mine. What about us? I asked. He hesitated, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he was choosing how to phrase it. This isn't about us not working, he said finally. It's about priorities. Long-term positioning. Long-term positioning. I nodded slowly, because in that moment, I understood something I hadn't been able to put into words before. I had been living inside a relationship. He had been managing a situation. I reached for the pen on the table. My hand didn't shake because I was afraid. It shook because something inside me had just gone completely still. Okay, I said. I signed my name. No argument. No negotiation. No attempt to change his mind. Because there was nothing left to change. He watched me for a second, and I saw it then. Relief. Not sadness. Not regret. Relief. He picked up the papers almost immediately, sliding them back into place with the same careful precision he had used when he first set them down. I'll move my things this weekend, he said. Like we were discussing logistics. Like this was normal. He grabbed his phone, his bag, his jacket, and then he walked out. No hesitation. No backward glance. Just the sound of the door closing behind him. The apartment felt different immediately. Quieter, but not peaceful. I sat there for a long time, one hand resting on my stomach, the other still holding the pen. For the first time since he walked in, I let myself feel it. Not the loss, not even the betrayal, but the weight of what came next. I looked over at the notebook on the table, the one where I had been writing down expenses, plans, small calculations to make everything stretch just a little further. I flipped it open. Rent, groceries, utilities, baby. Everything suddenly looked different. Everything suddenly mattered more. I placed my hand over my stomach, feeling the faint movement beneath it. We'll figure it out, I said quietly. Not as a promise. As a decision. Because that was the day I stopped waiting for someone to stay, and started preparing for what it meant to do everything alone. The first time I said it out loud, it didn't feel real. Father's name. The nurse didn't look up when she asked. Her pen hovered over the form. Ready. waiting for something she probably wrote down a dozen times a day without thinking. "There isn't one," I said. She paused for half a second, then nodded, writing something down in a space I couldn't see. That was it. No reaction. No follow-up question. Just a blank filled in where something was supposed to be. And somehow, that made it more real than anything else. The room was too bright, too cold. The kind of light that didn't let you hide from anything. Machines beeped softly in the background, steady and indifferent, like they didn't care what was happening in the space they occupied. I gripped the edge of the bed as another wave of pain hit, sharp and all-consuming. There was no hand to hold, no voice telling me it was going to be okay. Just me, and the sound of my own breathing. Hours blurred together after that. Time lost meaning somewhere between exhaustion and focus, between pain and determination. And then, suddenly, everything shifted. A cry, sharp, loud, alive. The sound cut through everything else in the room, through the noise, through the tension, through the quiet space I had been holding inside myself for months. They placed her on my chest before I was ready. Warm, small, real. I laughed. Even though I was crying, I couldn't tell the difference between the two. "Hi," I whispered, my voice barely steady. She moved slightly, her tiny hand curling instinctively, like she already knew she had to hold on. "Laura," I said. The name came out without hesitation, like it had always been hers. For the first time since Joshua walked out, I didn't feel alone. Not because things were easier, but because they were clear. This wasn't about what I had lost anymore. It was about what I had to protect. The apartment didn't feel like a home when I brought her back. It felt like a place I had to survive. The walls were thin enough that I could hear everything, neighbors arguing, footsteps overhead, a TV that never seemed to turn off somewhere down the hall. The furniture didn't match. Half of it was secondhand, the other half borrowed. There was a faint smell of something old that never completely went away, no matter how many times I cleaned. I set Laura down carefully in the small crib I had assembled myself, stepping back for a second to look at her. She slept like the world hadn't changed, like nothing had happened. I envied that. The first few weeks blurred into something that felt endless. Feedings at all hours, diapers, laundry, trying to sleep in fragments that never added up to enough. And in between all of that, I worked, or at least, I tried to. My laptop sat on the kitchen counter, its surface scratched from years of use, the battery unreliable enough that I kept it plugged in constantly. I edited videos while Laura slept, or while she cried, or while I held her in one arm and typed with the other. It wasn't good work. Not at first. The videos were inconsistent. The lighting was off. The audio wasn't always clear, and the numbers reflected that. Low views. Almost no engagement. Emails that never came. And the ones that did weren't much better. "We appreciate your interest, but your content doesn't align with our brand image at this time." I read that line more times than I could count. Each time, it felt less like feedback and more like confirmation. "You're not enough. You don't fit. You don't belong." But I didn't have the luxury of believing that. At night, when the apartment was quiet except for Laura's soft breathing and the hum of the refrigerator, I sat at the table with my notebook open in front of me. Rent, utilities, groceries, diapers, formula. Every number meant something. Every number had weight. I wrote them down carefully, adjusting, recalculating, trying to make everything stretch just a little further. There was no backup plan, no one to call, no safety net waiting if I fell. I was the plan, and plans didn't get to break. Some nights were harder than others. There was one in particular I still remember. Laura wouldn't stop crying, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to keep me from thinking clearly. I hadn't slept properly in days. The numbers in my notebook weren't adding up. The next bill was already overdue. I stood in the middle of the room, holding her, my body too tired to move, my mind too full to rest. For a second, I thought about sitting down and just letting everything catch up to me, letting the exhaustion win, letting the fear take over. But I didn't, because the moment I let go, everything else would follow. So I kept moving, slowly, mechanically, one step at a time. I fed her. I changed her. I rocked her until her breathing evened out again. And when she finally fell asleep, I didn't cry. I didn't break down. I sat back at the table, opened my laptop, and kept working. Because crying didn't solve anything, and I didn't have time for things that didn't solve anything. The first time something shifted, it was small, almost easy to miss. One of my videos performed slightly better than the others. Not viral, not even close, but enough to notice. A few more views, a few more comments. People responding to something I said. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to, trying to understand why, what was different, what worked. For the first time, it didn't feel random. It felt like something I could learn, something I could control. I started paying attention, watching patterns, testing ideas, adjusting how I spoke, how I edited, how I presented things. It wasn't fast. It wasn't easy, but it was movement, and movement meant possibility. A few days later, I saw a picture of Joshua online, a promotion announcement, a professional photo, clean, confident, Rachel standing beside him, smiling, like everything had worked out exactly the way he planned. I looked at it for a long time, not with anger, not even with sadness, just with clarity. He didn't lose anything. At least, that's what it looked like. I closed the screen and turned back to my work, because what it looked like didn't change what I had to do. That night, after Laura fell asleep, I opened my notebook again. The numbers were still there, still heavy, still real. But this time, I added something new. Not just expenses, not just survival. Ideas, plans, small steps toward something bigger than just getting through the next day. I stared at the page for a moment, the pen still in my hand. For the first time since everything fell apart, I wasn't asking how I was going to survive. I was starting to think about how I was going to build something. And that changed everything. Time didn't fix anything. It just gave things structure. Mornings started early, not because I wanted them to, but because they had to. Laura would be up before the sun some days, her small voice pulling me out of whatever sleep I had managed to piece together. I learned to move without thinking. Coffee, breakfast, backpack, shoes by the door. The apartment was still small, still imperfect, but it no longer felt like something I was trying to survive. It felt like something I was maintaining. There was a rhythm to it. Not easy, but predictable. And for a while, that was enough. Laura didn't grow the way other kids did. Not in the ways people usually notice. She didn't ask for things when we went to stores. Not because she didn't want them, but because she watched me closely enough to understand what things cost before I ever said it out loud. I saw it one afternoon. We were standing in a grocery store aisle, the kind with too many options and not enough space to think. She picked up a small box of cookies, turned it over in her hands, then quietly placed it back on the shelf. She didn't look at me when she did it. She didn't need to. "I can get it," I said, even though I knew I shouldn't. She shook her head. "It's okay." Simple. Final. Like she had already made the decision for both of us. I smiled, but something tightened in my chest. Children aren't supposed to understand limits that early. They're supposed to ask, to want, to expect. But Laura didn't, she observed. And that was harder to watch. She paid attention to everything. The way I checked prices twice before putting something in the cart. The way I hesitated before saying yes to anything that wasn't necessary. The way I worked late, even when I was tired. She didn't ask questions about it. She just learned from it. One afternoon, when she was about 8, she came home quieter than usual. Not upset, just thinking. She sat at the small table in the corner while I finished editing a video, her backpack still on her shoulders. I glanced over at her. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded, but didn't say anything right away. Then, after a moment, she looked up at me. Why don't I have a dad? The question didn't catch me off guard. Not because I had been waiting for it, but because I knew it would come eventually. I closed my laptop slowly, giving myself a second to think. There were a lot of ways to answer that question. Most of them weren't helpful. Do you feel like you need one? I asked instead. She considered that. Really considered it. Then she shook her head. No, she said. I have you. It wasn't said like reassurance. It wasn't said like she was trying to make me feel better. It was just her conclusion. And somehow, that made it heavier. I nodded, keeping my expression steady even though something inside me shifted. Okay, I said quietly. She went back to her homework like the conversation had ended. For her, it had. For me, it hadn't. That night, after she went to bed, I sat at the table longer than usual. The notebook was open in front of me. Pages filled with numbers, adjustments, plans that were just barely holding everything together. For the first time in a long time, I let myself feel something I had been avoiding. Not fear, not anger, but pressure. The kind that doesn't break you all at once, but builds slowly until you realize you've been carrying more than you thought. She deserved more than this. More than careful decisions and quiet compromises. More than learning how to go without before she even understood what having meant. I wiped my face quickly, not giving myself time to stay in that moment, because staying there didn't change anything. Doing something did. The next day, I changed the way I worked. Not the effort. That had never been the problem. The direction. Up until then, my content had been safe, neutral, designed not to stand out too much. That changed. I started talking about things I had avoided before. About being a single mother. About the parts no one posted. The exhaustion. The financial pressure. The constant calculation behind every decision. I didn't try to make it sound better than it was. I just told the truth. The first few videos felt different. Not because they performed better right away, but because they felt real in a way nothing I had done before did. And then, slowly, something shifted. Comments started appearing. Not a lot, but enough. I needed this. This is exactly how I feel. Thank you for saying it. I read every single one. Not because I had time to, but because I needed to understand what was connecting. One video did better than the rest. Still not viral. Still not enough to change everything overnight. But enough to notice. Enough to feel like I wasn't guessing anymore. A few days later, I received my first real inquiry. A small brand. Nothing major. But real. I stared at the email longer than I needed to, reading it more than once to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it. It wasn't much. But it was something I accepted. Carefully. Because I had already learned that not every opportunity was worth taking. Laura noticed the changes before I said anything. She watched me work the same way she always had. But this time, there was something different in her expression. One night, as I was editing, she sat across from me with a notebook of her own. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Working," I said. She nodded slowly, then looked down at her page. "Why do you work so much?" I paused for a second, considering the answer. "So we have choices later," I said. She didn't respond right away. She just wrote something down in her notebook. I didn't ask what it was. Some things didn't need to be explained. At school, things were different. Other kids talked about their parents in ways Laura didn't. Fathers picking them up. Family trips. Stories that didn't include gaps or missing pieces. She listened. But she didn't compare. At least, not in ways she showed. There was a meeting once. A teacher, polite but careful, asking if everything at home was stable. If Laura had enough support. I answered calmly, because stability didn't look the same for everyone. And I wasn't going to let anyone define her life by what wasn't there. That night, we had dinner at the small table like we always did. Nothing special, just food, conversation, The quiet comfort of routine. Laura laughed at something small, and for a second, everything else disappeared. I watched her, realizing something I hadn't fully understood before. She didn't grow up waiting for someone to come back. She grew up watching someone stay, and that made all the difference. Stability didn't arrive all at once. It showed up quietly, in small changes I almost didn't notice at first. The apartment became a house. Not large, not impressive, but ours. The walls didn't echo anymore. The neighbors didn't bleed through the ceiling. The air felt still in a different way, less heavy, more settled. I remember standing in the kitchen the first morning after we moved in, holding a cup of coffee and realizing I didn't feel like I was catching up anymore. For the first time in years, I wasn't behind. Laura was older by then, old enough to move through the house with a kind of quiet independence that didn't need permission. She left for school without reminders, finished her work without being asked, spoke when she had something to say, and stayed silent when she didn't. She didn't need constant direction. She observed, decided, and acted. That hadn't changed. What had changed was everything around her. My work wasn't survival anymore. It was structure. Content became consistent. The audience grew slowly but steadily, not in spikes, not in viral bursts, but in something more reliable. People came back. They listened. They trusted. Brand deals followed. But this time, I chose differently. I read every contract carefully, asked questions I wouldn't have known to ask before, paid attention to what I was giving up, not just what I was being offered. So when the first major offer came in, I knew exactly why it didn't feel right. It was everything I had worked toward. High-paying, long-term, stability built into the numbers. But the terms were clear. Control over messaging, restrictions on topics, approval before publishing. They didn't want my voice. They wanted a version of it, one that was easier to package, easier to sell. I sat at the table with the contract open in front of me, reading the same paragraph again and again, even though I already understood it. Laura walked in, glanced at the papers, then at me. "Good news?" she asked. "It could be," I said. She tilted her head slightly, studying my expression. "But it's not," she said. I smiled faintly. "Not the way they want it." She didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. That night, I declined the offer. It wasn't dramatic. No long explanation. No negotiation. Just a clear decision. I didn't build this life to lose control of it. The next morning, I went back to work like nothing had changed. But something had. I wasn't choosing what I could take anymore. I was choosing what I would allow. Laura noticed that too. Not in the words I used, but in the way I carried myself. She was in high school by then, top of her class without effort. Teachers who described her as focused, independent, unusually perceptive. She didn't chase attention. She evaluated it. I saw it in small ways. The way she listened more than she spoke. The way she watched people before deciding how to respond. The way she avoided situations that didn't make sense to her, even when others followed them without question. She didn't need approval, and she didn't offer it easily. But there was a distance, too. Not cold, not disconnected, just measured. I noticed it one evening when I asked her about her day. "Anything interesting happen?" I said, setting dinner on the table. "Not really," she replied, sitting down. It wasn't avoidance. It was selection. She shared what mattered, and kept the rest. I didn't push, because I understood that kind of thinking. But it left a quiet space between us that hadn't been there before. Not a gap. Just a difference. I felt it more in moments than in words. And I learned to accept it the same way I had accepted everything else. Without resistance. Without needing to fix it. A few days later, an email came in that didn't belong. The subject line was neutral. Professional. Easy to ignore. But the sender wasn't. The domain was familiar. Corporate. Structured. A name I hadn't seen in years. but one that connected back to a life I had already moved past. Joshua's world. I opened it slowly, reading each line carefully. A general inquiry. Something about data collaboration. A vague mention of shared audience insights. On the surface, it meant nothing, but it felt wrong, like something reaching across a distance that had been quiet for too long. I didn't respond. I closed the email and sat there for a moment, staring at the screen. Some things don't stay gone. They wait. Later that week, I saw another piece of information that didn't quite fit. A profile update. Rachel. Her name appeared in a professional context this time. Not personal. A shift in position. A quiet departure from the company she had been tied to for years. No explanation. No announcement. Just absence. People don't leave roles like that without a reason. I didn't feel satisfaction. There was no sense of balance being restored. Just recognition. Karma doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it just looks like consequences catching up. That evening, Laura walked into the room while I was still thinking about it. "You're quiet," she said. "Just working," I replied. She glanced at the laptop, then back at me. "Have you ever looked him up?" she asked. The question caught me off guard, not because of what it was, but because of how directly she asked it. "Sometimes," I said. She nodded once, like that confirmed something. "You don't need to," she said. I looked at her, waiting. "He'll come back," she added. Not emotional, not speculative. Certain. I felt something shift in my chest. "Why do you think that?" I asked. She didn't hesitate. "People don't come back unless they need something." The room went quiet after that. Not heavy. Just clear. She said it like it was obvious. Like it didn't need explanation. And for the first time, I realized something I hadn't fully seen before. She understood him. Not as a father. Not as a person she had missed. But as a pattern. And patterns don't change. They repeat. I closed the laptop slowly, her words settling into place in a way I couldn't ignore. For a while, I had believed that what we built was enough to keep the past where it belonged. That distance was protection. That time was separation. But sitting there, listening to her, I understood something else. Distance doesn't erase patterns. It just delays them. And for the first time, I stopped asking if he would come back. I started asking when. Joshua didn't disappear all at once. He faded. At first, it was subtle. A missed mention. A gap where something used to be. His name stopped appearing in the places it once did. Industry updates. Conference panels. Curated success posts that used to show up like clockwork. I noticed it because I had learned to notice patterns. People like him didn't step back. They stayed visible. Until they couldn't. I scrolled past an old article one afternoon. Something from years ago. His name still attached to a promotion announcement that had once looked like momentum. I remembered the version of him in that photo. Confident. Certain. Positioned exactly where he believed he belonged. Now, there was nothing new. No updates. No forward movement. Just silence. People don't go quiet like that unless something has shifted. I didn't look for details. But details have a way of surfacing anyway. A thread. A comment. A passing mention in a discussion I hadn't meant to read. Rachel's name appeared first. Not in the way it used to. Polished. Aligned. Positioned next to his like a continuation of the same story. This time, it was different. There were questions. Speculation. Quiet references to an internal review. Something about boundaries. About decisions that hadn't held up under scrutiny. Nothing confirmed. But enough to suggest a change. I didn't feel satisfaction reading it. Just recognition. Some stories don't end dramatically. They unravel. Slowly. Quietly. Until there's nothing left to hold them together. A few days later, I saw something else. A restructuring notice. Joshua's department mentioned, not directly, but close enough to matter. Language about realignment. About shifting priorities. About reducing redundancy. I knew what those words meant. They weren't about growth. They were about exposure. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen longer than I needed to. He had built everything on forward movement, on staying ahead, on always being the next version of himself. But forward movement doesn't protect you when everything behind you hasn't been secured. Momentum hides weaknesses, until it stops, and then all that's left is what you built underneath it. I didn't need to see the outcome to understand the direction. The second email confirmed it. The same domain, the same structure, but the tone was different. More formal, more precise. There were words this time that hadn't been there before. Audit, review, liability. I read it twice, not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. This wasn't about collaboration. This was about damage, about people trying to understand what had already happened and how far it might go. I closed the email slowly. He's in trouble, I said quietly, more to myself than to anyone else. Laura was standing in the doorway. I hadn't heard her come in. Is he? She asked. I didn't answer right away. She didn't need me to. She stepped further into the room, her eyes moving from the laptop screen to my face, reading what I wasn't saying. That's why he'll come back, she said. It wasn't a question. It was a conclusion. I exhaled slowly. People don't reconnect without a reason, I said. She nodded. And it's never the reason they say. There was no emotion in her voice. No anger. No curiosity. Just clarity. We stood there for a moment. The silence between us filled with something that didn't need to be explained. She understood him in a way I hadn't at her age. Not because she had known him, but because she had watched enough to recognize the pattern. I thought about everything that had brought us here. The years of building, the choices made one at a time. The slow, steady work that didn't depend on anyone else's decisions. And then I thought about him. The way he had moved through life. Fast, strategic, always looking ahead, never looking back. He chased growth. I built stability. At the time, it had felt like I was falling behind. Now, it felt like I had built something that didn't collapse when pressure showed up. A notification pulled my attention back to the screen. A message request. The name made me pause. Rachel. For a second, I didn't open it. I just stared at it, my mind already moving through possibilities I didn't need to confirm. Then I clicked. We need to talk about Joshua. That was it. No explanation. No context. Just urgency. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not from fear, but from the recognition of what it meant. People don't reach out like that unless they're out of options. Laura stepped closer, reading over my shoulder. She didn't react. She just watched. What do you think? I asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then she shook her head. We don't need her version, she said. Simple. Direct. And she was right. Whatever Rachel knew, whatever she had seen, it wouldn't change the outcome. We already understood enough. I closed the message without responding. For a moment, I considered it. Considered asking questions, filling in details, understanding the full picture. But I didn't need the full picture. I only needed to understand what mattered. And what mattered was this. He was no longer in control of his own situation, which meant he would look for control somewhere else. I turned off the screen and sat back, letting the quiet settle around me again. For years, I had thought of Joshua as something that belonged to the past, a decision already made, a chapter already closed. But patterns don't stay in the past. They wait. And when the conditions are right, they repeat. He hasn't reached out yet, I said. Laura didn't respond. She didn't need to. We both knew what came next. I looked at the blank screen in front of me. His name no longer visible but still present in a way that couldn't be ignored. He will, I said finally. Not with uncertainty. Not with doubt. Just with understanding. Because men like him don't come back when they're whole. They come back when they're running out of options. It was an ordinary morning. The kind that didn't give you any warning. I was at my desk, reviewing analytics from a video that had performed better than expected, making small adjustments to the next upload, answering emails in the quiet rhythm I had built over the years. Everything was controlled, predictable, earned. That was when his name appeared. Joshua. Not in a memory, not in a passing thought. On my screen. A message. Short. Direct. I'd like to talk. I stared at it for a second. Longer than I needed to. Not because I was surprised, but because I wasn't right on time. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, no reference to anything that had happened before. Just a statement. Like the space between then and now didn't need to be addressed. Like he could start from wherever it suited him. I didn't respond. Not immediately. I closed the message and leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch just long enough to remind myself of something I had learned the hard way. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about control. I stood up, walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and gave myself time. Time to think. Time to choose. Because responding too quickly would mean reacting. And I didn't react anymore. When I came back, I opened the message again. I typed slowly. What do you want? No greeting. No softness. No opening for anything unnecessary. I sent it before I could overthink it. The response came faster than I expected. A call. His name lit up the screen again. I let it ring once. Twice. 3 times. Then I answered. Hello? Megan. His voice hadn't changed as much as I thought it would. Still controlled. Still measured. Still carrying that quiet confidence that came from believing things could always be adjusted. It's been a while, he said. Yes, I replied. I didn't fill the silence. I let it sit there. He cleared his throat slightly. A small break in the rhythm he was trying to maintain. I've been thinking, he continued, about a lot of things. I didn't respond. He kept going. About the past. About what matters. There it was. The vague language. The positioning. The setup. I think it's time I meet my daughter, he said. Not a question. A decision. Framed like something he had the right to claim. I felt something settle inside me. Not anger. Not shock. Just confirmation. Why now? I asked. There was a pause. Short. Controlled. But real. Things change, he said. You start to see things differently. Priorities shift. I almost smiled. The words were right. The tone was wrong. And I pressed. I've built a lot, he continued. A career. A position, but at some point, you start thinking about legacy. Legacy. The word landed exactly where he intended it to. Calculated. Strategic. And you think that involves her? I asked. It should, he said. She's my daughter. There was no hesitation in that. No awareness of what it ignored. I leaned back slightly, letting the silence stretch again. He didn't like silence. He filled it quickly. I'm not asking for anything complicated, he added. Just a chance to talk. To connect. Connect. As if connection was something you could schedule. As if it didn't require presence. As if it hadn't already been defined by absence. I listened to him for a moment longer. Not to understand what he was saying, but to hear what he wasn't. No apology. No responsibility. No acknowledgement of what had been left behind. Just intention. And need. I'll think about it, I said. Another pause. This one longer? I think that's fair, he replied. We ended the call without anything else. No closing statement. No attempt to soften it. Just an ending. I sat there for a moment, the phone still in my hand, the quiet around me unchanged. But different. He had reached out. Exactly when we expected. That evening, Laura came home and found me in the same place. You heard from him? She said. Not a question. I nodded. He wants to meet you. She didn't react immediately. She set her bag down, moved through the kitchen like it was any other day. then turned to face me. "What did you say?" she asked. "That I'd think about it." She nodded once. "That's good." I watched her for a moment, trying to read something in her expression. There wasn't much there. Not because she was hiding it, because she had already processed it. "What do you think?" I asked. She didn't hesitate. "I think he needs something," she said. I exhaled quietly. "So do I." She looked at me then, not surprised, just confirming. "I'll meet him," she said. The words were calm, decided, not emotional, not reactive. A choice. "You're sure?" I asked. She nodded. "Yes." There was no hesitation in her voice. No uncertainty. Just clarity. I felt a flicker of something, concern. Maybe, but it passed quickly. Because this wasn't my decision anymore. It was hers. "Then we do it on our terms," I said. She tilted her head slightly. "How?" "Not here," I said. "Not private." She understood immediately. "A public place," she said. "Yes." She thought for a moment, then nodded again. "Let him talk first." I looked at her, recognizing the strategy and the simplicity of it. Let him define himself. Let him reveal what he wanted. She wasn't preparing for a conversation. She was preparing for clarity. I picked up my phone again and typed a message. "We can meet. Public setting. I'll send details." He responded quickly. "Of course." No resistance. No questions. That told me everything I needed to know. He believed he was still in control. That the setting didn't matter. That the outcome would be his to shape. I set the phone down and looked at Laura. She was already moving on, picking up her notebook, flipping to a clean page. No tension. No anticipation. Just readiness. I realized something then. He thought he was walking into a conversation. He thought he was re-entering something he had left behind. But this wasn't the same place. And we weren't the same people. He had no idea what he was stepping into. And for the first time, that worked in our favor. The house was quiet in a way that felt intentional. Not empty. Not tense. Just focused. The kind of quiet that comes when something important is about to happen and no one needs to say it out loud. I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook open in front of me. The same one I had carried through years of numbers. Adjustments. And plans that had once been about survival. Now, it held something different. Structure. Laura sat across from me. Her posture relaxed, but her attention sharp. Like she had already stepped into a role neither of us had named. "We should know everything before we meet him," she said. Not hesitant. Not unsure. Just clear. I nodded. I agree. There was no emotional hesitation between us. No question of whether this was too much or too soon. This wasn't about facing him. It was about being ready for whatever he brought with him. I reached into the drawer beside me and pulled out a stack of documents I hadn't looked at in years. Paper doesn't forget. It just waits. Old court filings, medical bills, school records, receipts that had once meant stress and calculation, now laid out in front of us like pieces of something that had already been completed. Laura didn't react the way I had when I first saw them. She didn't pause. She didn't hesitate. She started organizing. "Let's separate them by type," she said, sliding one stack to the side. "Timeline first, then financial." I watched her for a second. Something shifting in the way I saw her. She wasn't discovering anything. She was confirming it. We worked in silence for a while. Pages moved from one side of the table to the other, forming patterns that had once been scattered. Dates lined up. Gaps became visible. Absences turned into something measurable. "This is everything?" she asked. "Everything I kept," I said. She nodded. "Already thinking ahead. We should cross-check this with state law," she said, "just to understand what it actually means." I looked at her, surprised for only a second before I remembered. Law. That was where she was heading. Of course she thought like this. We pulled up the information together, going through statutes, guidelines, Numbers that translated years of absence into something structured. Not emotional. Not subjective. Just factual. We calculated, slowly, carefully. 21 years. Support never given. Expenses carried alone. Costs that had accumulated quietly. Without acknowledgement. The number that formed at the end wasn't shocking. It was expected. Because we had lived it. "This isn't about money," Laura said, her voice steady. "No," I agreed. "It's about record." I nodded. That was exactly what it was. A record of what had happened. A record of what hadn't. My phone buzzed softly on the table. I glanced at it, already knowing what I would see. "Rachel." Another message. More urgent this time. "You need to know what he's done." I didn't open it right away. Laura noticed. "Her again?" she asked. "Yes." I turned the screen toward her. She read it quickly, her expression unchanged. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she shook her head. "We don't need her version," she said. I felt a small sense of relief at that. Not because I didn't want to know, but because I didn't need to. Whatever Rachel had to say, it wouldn't change what mattered. We already had the truth. We had lived it. I closed the message without responding and set the phone aside. "She's desperate," I said quietly. Laura didn't look up from the documents. "That means he is too," she replied. Simple. Direct. Accurate. I leaned back slightly, watching her as she continued organizing everything in front of her with a level of clarity I hadn't had at her age. "He avoids responsibility," she said after a moment, "and comes back when it benefits him." I didn't interrupt. "He's not here to build something," she continued. "He's here to use something." I exhaled slowly. Hearing it said out loud didn't change anything, but it made it sharper, more defined. "You see him clearly," I said. She looked up then, meeting my eyes. "I don't have anything to feel about him," she said. "So I can—" There was no anger in that. No resentment. Just absence. And in a strange way, that was stronger than anything else. "We meet him in public," I said, shifting the focus back. "Yes. No private conversations?" "Agreed." I paused for a second. "Let him talk first." She nodded immediately. "He'll tell us everything we need to know," she said. We both understood what that meant. People reveal themselves when they believe they're in control. And Joshua always believed he was. Later that evening, the documents were organized into a clean, structured file. Not messy, not emotional, precise. I closed it slowly, placing it in front of her. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I asked. She didn't hesitate. "I'm not doing it for him," she said. I waited. "I'm doing it so it's finished." The words settled in the space between us. Not heavy. Not dramatic. Final. I looked down at the notebook in front of me, flipping back through the pages. Early entries filled with numbers that once felt overwhelming. Rent. Groceries. Bills that didn't leave room for mistakes. Then later pages. Plans. Strategies. Ideas that had built something more than just survival. Everything we had gone through was there. Not as memories, but as proof. Proof that we had carried everything he had left behind. Proof that we had built something anyway. I closed the notebook and looked back at Laura. She was already gathering the file, placing it neatly into her bag. No hesitation. No second thoughts. Just readiness. That night, the house felt even quieter than before. Not because something was missing, but because everything was in place. "We're not preparing to face him," I said, almost to myself. Laura looked at me. "No," she replied. "We're preparing to end this." I nodded. For the first time, I understood something clearly. He wasn't the one walking into that meeting with power. He just didn't know it yet. The ballroom looked exactly the way rooms like that always do. Warm lighting that softened everything just enough to make it feel intentional. Low music that filled the silence without interrupting conversations. People standing in small circles, exchanging words that sounded casual but carried weight. We arrived on time. Not early. Not late. On time. There's a difference. Walking into a space like that used to feel like stepping into something I didn't belong to. Like I had to adjust myself to fit the tone, the pace, the expectations that no one explained but everyone seemed to understand. That feeling was gone. Not because the room had changed. Because I had... Laura walked beside me, her posture steady, her expression neutral in a way that made her almost invisible at first glance, and unforgettable once you noticed her. She didn't scan the room. She didn't hesitate. She moved like she already understood the rules, even though no one had ever taught them to her. "This is where he would be," she said quietly. I nodded. "He won't stay at the edges." And he didn't. I saw him before he saw us. Across the room, positioned exactly where someone like him would place himself. Not in the center. Not drawing obvious attention. But close enough that attention could find him easily. He held a glass in his hand, speaking to two men who leaned slightly toward him, listening more than talking. His posture hadn't changed. Still controlled. Still confident. Still built on the assumption that he understood the room better than anyone else in it. For a moment, I just watched him. Not because I needed to. Because I wanted to see if anything about him had shifted. It hadn't. He was still performing. Laura followed my gaze, her eyes settling on him with a kind of quiet assessment that didn't need words. "That's him," she said. Yes. She didn't ask anything else. She didn't need to. Her attention moved once, briefly, to the small table beside him. A box sat there. Clean. Structured. Deliberate. Gift-wrapped in a way that made it obvious it was meant to be noticed without looking like it was. She looked back at me. "He brought something," she said. Of course he did. We didn't say anything else about it, because we both understood what it meant. Joshua noticed us a few seconds later. It was subtle. His eyes moved across the room in that same calculated way. Scanning. Measuring. Identifying, and then they stopped. For just a fraction of a second. Something real crossed his face. Surprise. It disappeared almost immediately, replaced by something practiced. He adjusted his stance, finished his sentence, and excused himself from the conversation with a confidence that suggested he believed he was moving toward something he controlled. "He's coming," Laura said. "I know." We didn't move. We didn't shift. We let him approach. The closer he got, the clearer the details became. The suit, the watch, the expression he had perfected over years of navigating rooms like this. He stopped in front of us, just close enough to make it personal, just far enough to keep it composed. "Megan," he said. I nodded once. "Joshua?" No warmth. No tension. Just acknowledgement. His attention moved to Laura immediately. Of course it did. He studied her for a second, like he was trying to align what he saw with something he had already decided. "You've grown," he said. It sounded like something he thought he should say, not something he felt. Laura didn't respond. She just looked at him. Not challenging. Not inviting. Just looking. He shifted slightly, reaching for the box on the table beside him. "I brought you something," he said, holding it out. The gesture was smooth. Practiced. Like it had worked for him before. Laura took it without hesitation. "Thank you," she said. Her tone was polite. Nothing more. He seemed to take that as a positive sign. I could see it in the way his shoulders relaxed just slightly, in the way his expression settled back into confidence. He thought he had found his footing. Rachel appeared at the edge of my vision before she fully stepped into it. I didn't expect her to be there. That was the first thing. The second was how different she looked. Not dramatically. Not in a way anyone else would immediately notice. But enough. Less composed. Less certain. Like something had shifted in a way she couldn't fully hide. Her eyes moved between Joshua, Laura, and me. Recognition settling in with a quiet tension that didn't belong in a room like this. She didn't approach immediately. She stayed just outside the space. Watching, waiting. Joshua didn't notice her. Not yet. He was focused on the moment he thought he was building. On the version of the story he believed he could still control. He turned slightly, angling his body just enough to include the small group nearby without making it obvious. His voice lifted just enough to carry, "I've been meaning to do this," he said. Not to us. To them. To the room. People shifted, subtly at first. A glance. A pause. A slight change in posture. Attention moved. He continued, speaking about things that sounded familiar: work, progress, growth, laying the groundwork for something he hadn't said yet. Laura stood still beside me. Not reacting. Not engaging. Just waiting. The room adjusted around us. Conversation slowed. Eyes lingered a little longer than they should have. Rachel stepped a little closer, her presence now visible to more than just me. She still didn't speak. But she didn't leave either. Joshua's confidence grew with every second the room gave him its attention. He didn't see the shift. He didn't feel the change in the energy around him. Because he believed he was creating it. And that was the mistake. He positioned himself at the center of the small group now, his body open, his expression set, his voice ready. He turned toward Laura, toward the moment he thought he had prepared. I felt the stillness beside me. Not tension. Not fear. Control. He thought this was his moment. He thought he was about to define something. But standing there, watching him, I realized something with complete clarity. He didn't understand the room anymore. And he didn't understand the person he was about to speak for. Laura didn't move. She didn't react. But I could see it in the way she stood. She had already decided how this would end. He just hadn't realized it yet. Because the moment he was about to create wasn't his. It was the moment everything he thought he controlled would start to fall apart. "I want you all to meet my daughter." Joshua's voice carried just enough to reach the people closest to him. And just enough beyond that to draw attention without sounding like he was trying. His hand rested on Laura's shoulder again. Light. Controlled. Possessive in a way he probably didn't even recognize. For a moment, the room didn't react. It paused. A subtle shift. Like a breath being held collectively by people who didn't yet know why. I felt it immediately. The change in energy. The way conversations softened without stopping completely. The way eyes began to move. Quietly. Toward us. Joshua smiled. Confident. Certain. Like everything was unfolding exactly the way he expected. Laura didn't move. She didn't step away. She didn't react. She just stood there. Still and composed. Letting the silence stretch longer than it should have. Someone nearby cleared their throat. A glass touched a table a little too hard. Small sounds. Amplified by the quiet. Joshua's smile held. But I saw it then. The first flicker. A moment where something didn't align with what he expected. Laura reached up calmly and lifted his hand off her shoulder. Not forcefully. Not dramatically. Just removed it. Then she looked at him. Directly? "No," she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "You're not my father." The words settled into the space between us like something solid. Something that couldn't be undone. The room went still. Not quiet. Still. People stopped pretending not to listen. Joshua let out a short laugh. It came too quickly. Too controlled. "She's joking," he said, glancing briefly at the people around him. "We're reconnecting." He tried to smooth it over. To reshape it. To bring it back into something manageable. Laura didn't look at anyone else. She didn't acknowledge the room. She kept her eyes on him. "You don't get to claim that now," she said. Same tone. Same calm. No emotion to push against. No reaction for him to redirect. Just a statement. Joshua's expression shifted again. Slightly tighter. Slightly sharper. "You're my daughter," he said. His voice firmer now. "That doesn't change." He leaned into the word like it carried weight on its own. Like saying it was enough. Laura didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't match his tone. Being a father isn't a title you claim, she said. It's something you do. The silence deepened. Not empty. Not passive. Heavy. People were watching openly now. Not glancing. Watching. Joshua's confidence didn't disappear. But it changed. It shifted into something more rigid. More controlled. Like he was holding on to it instead of standing in it. You don't understand the full picture, he said. His words coming faster now. There were circumstances. Things you weren't aware of. He was trying to explain. To build context. To regain ground. Laura didn't interrupt. She let him finish. Then she spoke. I understand enough, she said. That was it. No elaboration. No expansion. Just enough. Rachel stepped closer then. Not into the center, but close enough that her presence became part of the moment. Joshua noticed her. Just for a second. And in that second, something else shifted. A distraction. A fracture. He hadn't expected her to be there. Laura didn't look at Rachel. She didn't need to. Everything she was doing was focused. Deliberate. Joshua tried again. You're making this into something it's not, he said, his voice tightening. I'm here because I want to fix things. Fix. The word hung in the air. Laura's expression didn't change. There's nothing to fix, she said. That landed differently. Not like rejection, like closure. Around us, people had stopped pretending to engage in anything else. The small group that had formed was no longer subtle. It was intentional. Joshua could feel it now. The attention. The shift. The fact that this was no longer something he controlled. You don't get to decide that, he said. There it was. Authority. Not earned. Assumed. Laura held his gaze. Yes, I do. No hesitation. No doubt. The words didn't challenge him. They replaced him. I watched him carefully. The way his posture adjusted. The way his shoulders tightened. The way his eyes moved. Just briefly. To the people around him before returning to her. He was calculating. Looking for a way to reposition. To recover. But there wasn't one. Not anymore. The room had already shifted. The narrative he was trying to hold on to no longer belonged to him. Laura took a small step back. Not retreating. Just creating space. Between them. Between what he was trying to say and what had already been established. For the first time. Joshua didn't speak immediately. He stood there. The silence pressing in around him. Waiting for something to move back in his direction. Nothing did. I could see it then. Clear. Unavoidable. He was running out of options. And he didn't even know how far he had already fallen. Laura's hand moved slightly toward her bag. A small movement. Almost unnoticeable. But I knew what it meant. This wasn't over. Not yet. Because what came next wasn't about words. And there was nothing he could say to stop it. Laura didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a slim, structured folder, placing it calmly on the small table beside her. The movement was quiet, deliberate, and somehow, louder than anything that had been said so far. Joshua looked at it, confusion flickering across his face. What is that? He asked. Laura didn't answer immediately. She opened the folder, her movements precise. Controlled, like she had already done this in her mind more than once. This, she said finally, is a record. She lifted the first page. Not toward him. Toward the space between them. Toward the room that had gone completely still. A record of what you didn't do. The words didn't accuse. They defined. Joshua's expression tightened. I don't know what you think this is, he started. Laura didn't look at him. She kept her focus on the page. 21 years, she said. Her voice didn't change. No emphasis. No hesitation. Child support not paid? Medical expenses not covered. Education costs not contributed to. Each line landed clean. Structured. Unarguable. Joshua shifted his weight slightly. His posture losing the effortless balance it had carried earlier. That's not accurate, he said quickly. You don't understand the situation. Laura turned a page. I understand that you were notified, she said. Multiple times. Another page. I understand that you chose not to respond. Another. I understand that responsibility doesn't disappear just because you decide to ignore it. The room wasn't just quiet anymore. It was focused. People weren't just listening. They were evaluating. Joshua glanced around briefly, as if searching for something, support, distraction, a way to reframe what was happening. There was none. You're taking this out of context, he said, his voice sharper now. There were circumstances, legal complications, things your mother didn't tell you. For the first time, he looked at me, like I was something he could still use to redirect the moment. I didn't move. I didn't respond. I didn't give him anything to work with. Laura closed the folder halfway, her eyes finally meeting his again. You had every opportunity to know, she said. Not louder. Not stronger. Just final. Joshua's jaw tightened. That's not how it works, he said. You don't just show up with paperwork and decide what this means. Laura tilted her head slightly. I'm not deciding anything, she replied. I'm showing you what already happened. That was the difference. And everyone in that room could feel it. Rachel stepped forward then. Not dramatically. Not loudly. But enough to shift the space again. Joshua turned toward her, his expression tightening further. Rachel! Don't, he said under his breath. She ignored him. Her eyes moved from him to Laura, then briefly to me. There was something in her expression now that hadn't been there before. Not confidence. Not alignment. Distance. He knew, she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Joshua's head snapped back toward her. Stop, he said, sharper this time. Rachel didn't stop. He knew about the notices, she continued. He chose not to deal with them. The room shifted again. Not dramatically, but enough. Enough for people to start connecting what they were hearing with what they were seeing. Joshua looked at her like he didn't recognize her, like she had stepped out of a role he thought she would always play. You don't understand what you're saying, he said. I do, she replied quietly. And then she stepped back, out of the center, out of the moment, leaving him there. Alone in it. Laura closed the folder completely and held it in front of her for a second before lowering it. Then she looked at him. Not with anger. Not with anything that could be pushed against. I know you by what you didn't do, she said. The words didn't hit like an attack. They settled like a fact. Something that didn't need to be argued. Something that didn't leave space for interpretation. Joshua didn't respond immediately. For the first time, he didn't have something ready. No reframing. No repositioning. Just silence. Laura took a small breath, then spoke again. If you want anything from me, she said, start with responsibility. She didn't say more. She didn't need to. The condition was clear. Not emotional. Not negotiable. Just there. Joshua stood there, the weight of the moment settling around him, pressing in from all sides. The room hadn't turned against him. It had just stopped supporting him. And that was enough. He looked at the folder in her hand, then at her, then briefly at me, like he was searching for something, permission, maybe, or a way out. There wasn't one. He didn't take the folder. He didn't argue further. He didn't accept what had been laid in front of him either. He just stood there. And then, without another word, he turned. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to break the moment. He walked away the same way he had walked in. Controlled. Measured. But something was missing now. Something that hadn't been there before. Rachel didn't follow him. She stayed where she was for a second longer, then turned in the opposite direction, disappearing into the room without looking back. I watched him go, the distance between us growing again. Not the same distance as before. This one was different. Defined. Clear. He didn't lose everything in that moment. Not his career. Not his position. Not whatever he still believed he had built. What he lost was something quieter, something harder to rebuild. The illusion that he was still in control. And once that's gone, there's nothing left to stand on. The room didn't explode. It didn't erupt into whispers or gasps or anything dramatic enough to match what had just happened. It simply shifted. Conversations resumed, but softer, more careful. People moved again, but with an awareness that hadn't been there before. Joshua was gone. Not in a way that drew attention, just absent, like a space that had been filled and then quietly emptied. I stood there for a moment longer, letting the stillness settle. Nothing inside me felt like victory. There was no rush of satisfaction, no sense of something won, just a quiet release, like something that had been held in place for years had finally been allowed to fall away. Laura stepped beside me. She didn't look back. Neither did I. "Ready?" I asked. She nodded once. We walked out together, leaving the room behind without needing to say anything more. Outside, the air felt different. Cooler, cleaner, the kind of quiet that belongs to the end of something, not the tension before it. We didn't talk right away. We didn't need to. Our steps stayed in rhythm, side by side, moving away from a moment that had already finished itself. After a while, Laura spoke. "It's done." Her voice was calm, not relieved, not emotional, just certain. I nodded. Yes. That was all it needed to be. Done. Not resolved by him. Not closed by anything he said or didn't say. But finished on our terms. We got into the car and drove without discussing it further. No replaying the conversation. No analyzing what had happened. Because there was nothing left to understand. We had already understood it long before tonight. The restaurant we stopped at wasn't special. That was the point. A small place we had been to before. Warm lighting. Familiar menu. No one paying attention to who we were or where we had just come from. We sat down at our usual table. Ordered without thinking. The same things we always did. Routine. Normal. Uncomplicated. Laura leaned back slightly. Her shoulders relaxed in a way they hadn't been earlier. For the first time that night, she smiled. Not because something had been achieved. Because something had been removed. I watched her for a moment, realizing how different this felt from what I had imagined years ago. Back then, I thought a moment like this would be louder, more final, more visible. But it wasn't. It was quiet, almost ordinary, and that made it more real. "I don't hate him," Laura said suddenly. I looked at her. She wasn't avoiding the subject. She was closing it. "He just doesn't belong in my life," she added. No anger. No hesitation. Just clarity. I nodded slowly. "That's enough," I said. Because it was, hate ties you to something. Keeps it close. This didn't feel like that. This felt like distance. Like something that had already been left behind. Finally losing the last bit of weight it carried. I thought about him then. Not the version of him from tonight. Not the one who stood in that room trying to control something he no longer understood. But the version of him from years ago, standing in that living room. Talking about timing. About impact. About how we didn't fit into the life he was building. He didn't lose that life because of us. He lost it because of how he chose to build it. We didn't take anything from him. He walked away from it. And there's a difference between losing something and leaving it behind. One is taken, the other is chosen. Laura picked up her glass, taking a small sip before setting it back down. "What's next?" she asked. I smiled faintly. "Whatever you want it to be." She nodded, already thinking ahead. Her future wasn't something she was waiting for anymore. It was something she was building, the same way we always had, step by step, without needing permission, without needing anything from the past to move forward. Dinner ended the way it always did. No rush, no urgency, just the quiet comfort of knowing where we were going next. And for the first time in a long time, I realized something fully. Revenge wasn't what happened in that room. It wasn't the moment he lost control. It wasn't the way the truth came out. It was everything that came before it. Every night we didn't give up. Every decision we made without him. Every step that built something he could never step back into. We didn't destroy him. We outgrew him. And once you outgrow something, it doesn't matter if it comes back. It no longer fits. If you've ever been left behind, if someone made you feel like you were something they could walk away from, I want you to understand this. You don't need them to come back. You don't need them to explain. And you definitely don't need them to choose you. You build a life where their absence stops mattering. And one day, if they do come back, they'll realize they don't belong there anymore. And if this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to rebuild your life piece by piece, stay with me. There are more stories like this. Stories about strength, about truth, about what happens when people underestimate you. So don't forget to subscribe. And I'll see you in the next one. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.